BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, today we are looking at inheritance tax. The row over its reintroduction on farms has intensified this week, with another big tractor protest in London and a smaller rally disrupting a prime ministerial visit. Sir Keir Starmer says it just highlights the difficult choices the government has to make, while farmers warn they'll be put out of business. Well, we've had a lot of questions from you about the tax, and today we're going to try to answer them with the help of our panel. Joining us are Aled Jones, who is an 8th generation farmer and president of the National Farmers Union, Cymru. Emily Norton is the founder of the rural business advisory service Farm Foresight and herself is part of a family farm partnership in Norfolk. And Dan Neidle is a tax expert who runs Tax Policy Associates. Well, welcome to you all. The very basics of this are that from April 2026, inherited agricultural assets worth more than £1 million will be liable to inheritance tax at 20%. That's half the usual rate. And now, for the last 30 years, agricultural assets have been exempt from inheritance tax through agricultural and also business property relief. So let's just start by seeing where you all are on this. Aled, will this tax affect your farm?
You mentioned, Charlotte, that I'm an 8th generation. Well, that's the 8th generation that we can trace. And every generation has always passed on to the next generation a business which is stronger, more invested than the previous. Long term, it's that confidence in the business which can be seriously eroded here. We've been through not only our own personal figures on the farm, but our membership as well. And every day passes and I'm more fearful of the long-term impacts.
Emily, are you too making plans as a family because of this tax?
Yeah, we absolutely are making plans as a family. I am in a relatively fortunate position in that my parents are in their mid-70s and so they've got time to plan. And one of the upsides of that is that I've now been made, almost touch wood, a property-owning partner in our family business. And so it's just accelerated the changes that they were planning to make later on in life and brought those decisions forward. So I've now got more opportunity to get on with the business than I had before.
Dan, is this a workable tax?
It depends what you're trying to do. Are you trying to raise money? Is the government trying to raise money? I don't think this raises very much. It's hard to say because the figures are kind of rubbish. The problem is there's a lot of inheritance tax avoidance, people who aren't farmers buying farmland just to get an inheritance tax exemption. And the government's changes don't stop them doing that. So viewed that way, these changes don't go far enough. On the other hand, the way the changes affect small farms, particularly farms that are not very profitable, is quite serious.
The rules here are quite complicated, and at this point we have to put our hands up. We got them wrong ourselves on Wednesday's programme when we said that farmers will pay half the IHT of other businesses. What we meant to say was that they'll pay half the standard rate of IHT on liable assets, so 20%, not 40%. There's a lot of anger in farming communities about this. Earlier this week I was in Westminster, surrounded by tractors. I'm on Whitehall at the moment. There are stationary tractors, 6 abreast, the entire length from Trafalgar Square right down to Parliament Square. And you may be able to hear some beeping in the background. That is the tractors queuing in Trafalgar Square, trying to park up. It's a much bigger protest than ones that have been held here before. Organisers say they're expecting something in the region of 1,500 tractors.
His way of making a point on it.
We've had demonstrations all over the country, including here in London. It's not really working. They're not changing their minds.
Well, it's just only going to get bigger and better from here, though, isn't it?
Work keep coming as long as we have to. This is massive. We're going to feed England. We're going back to the war days where, dig for Britain.
We just need to keep it in the news, keep everybody aware that the future needs us, and we've just got to make an impact now.
We've been here before. I mean, I've literally stood here before talking to farmers. What happens if these sorts of protests don't work? What's next?
To be honest, don't know. Couldn't tell you. I don't know where it goes from here. We're just hoping something changes, I suppose.
Well, that was people on Monday's protest. It was the third big protest in the capital. There have been ongoing tractor rallies around the country protesting about this issue, and that's prompted quite a few questions from listeners. These are fairly typical. Richard says, are the tractor protests really showing farmers in a good light? Rows and rows of expensive kit blocking roads. I'm not impressed by farmers, he says, who fail to see how much financial help they are receiving. Alison from Yorkshire emailed, all those very smart tractors would suggest that there's no big problem in farming. This inheritance tax is only for the next generation to pay once in their lives. Aled, what would you say to Richard and Alison there?
Those tractors are not luxury items, I would say. You know, it's a necessity because they are the work machines that we need on farms today.
But Alison makes the point that farmers will only have to pay this once a generation. So why are you so concerned about it?
When you consider the ability of the industry to pay an additional tax, that is the worry amongst so many farmers across the country. The income, the profit that some of these farmers make are to the minimum wage levels. Yet their farming assets, farms worth, several £million. So in the eventuality of having to pay inheritance tax, the income is simply not there to be enabling them to pay the tax as well. And inevitably, parcels of land would be the only option available to these businesses, and that would, surely enough, lead to a contraction of many farming businesses.
Emily, what do you make of the protests?
I understand why farmers are angry, but what disappoints me most is the language which harks back to the Second World War and this dig for victory approach, and that we're somehow kind of entitled to be essential to the national identity. We've got the biggest transformation facing land use since the Second World War. We need to kind of get the entire industry being something that it's not quite being at the moment. And I completely understand why people are struggling with that. But the solution to that is not necessarily going backwards. It's certainly not kind of declaring war and some of the really irresponsible language, I think, that's been kind of used in this space. It is about helping as many farmers as possible adapt their businesses to meet these future expectations of what supply chains are telling us, what government is telling us, what our consumers are telling us we need to be. And I think that's quite a difficult position for farmers to be in at the moment, where we've a proportion of the industry is literally downed tools and said, we don't want to listen to you anymore. And I think that's negative.
Well, actually, earlier this week on Tuesday, the farming minister, Dan Zeichner, actually talked about that changing relationship between farming and the government. He caused a bit of a stir with his comments at the Norfolk Farming Conference. He explained that since Brexit, when farming, of course, had to start competing with the NHS and so on for government money, farming, as he put it, wasn't high on the pecking order.
I remember the day after the Brexit referendum, some of you in this room, I suspect, came to me in Cambridge and said, Daniel, what's going to happen now? Where are we going to be in that pecking order? But where we are in that pecking order is never going to be great. So that's why we've got to get this sector onto a proper, sustainable, business-like footing. That will give security in the future.
Well, Anna Hill caught up with him after the speech and asked if it was worth causing farmers anger, upset and even fear to raise around £500 million a year through inheritance tax.
The budget as a whole was designed to address the challenges that we face as an incoming government, the mess we inherited from the previous government. So we're not going to be undoing the budget. But what I've been setting out today is a strong vision for the future of British farming, which will involve resilient businesses that can also address the nature and climate challenges. That's a really exciting challenge, and I'd encourage people to engage with that.
At the end of your speech, you were asked quite a hard question from a farmer about support. And you actually replied and said there has to be a shift in the way farmers think about their relationship with government funding.
Indeed, this came as a consequence of Brexit. We've moved away from the Common Agricultural Policy to a public money for public goods approach, environmental land management schemes. Government is buying environmental benefits on behalf of taxpayers. Farmers can absolutely benefit from that, but they also need to be making money from their basic task, which is to produce the food for the nation. It is a big change, but I genuinely think when we look back, people say it was the right thing to do.
The Farming Minister, Dan Zeichner, there. Now, he mentioned that farms need to make money from producing food. That's something that one listener, Alan, whom I'm assuming is a farmer, picked up on. He says cheap food wins votes, but you can't have cheap food produced at high standards without subsidising the industry. I hate taking taxpayers' money, he says, but we can't be squeezed anymore. All we ask for is for a fair price for our produce, so we have a margin to reinvest and pay taxes. Pauline emailed in. She says this government is obsessed with raising taxes and in so doing is completely ignoring the long-term consequences. We need to produce as much food at home as possible and we need to keep wealthy people investing and benefiting this country. The proposed tax, she says, will do neither of those things. Alid, if farming were more profitable, would this tax be more acceptable?
No, I don't think so. I think tax the activities of the business. The principle of income tax, whereby if there is a surplus, there is a contribution to the treasury, is very well embedded within this country. The transfer of an asset doesn't generate cash. So you're having to generate that to cash to pay it simply by selling assets.
Dan?
I don't agree with that at all. If I work and earn £1 million, I'm taxed on it. It can't be right that if I inherit £1 million with no effort on my part, there's no tax at all. If I inherit £1 million, I should pay inheritance tax on it. In principle, if I inherit a business worth £1 million, I should pay that on that too. The argument for farming is that the economics of farming is currently so broken that whilst most businesses could afford to pay, say 4% over 10 years to pay out the inheritance tax, a farming business cannot.
Emily?
I think one of my big concerns and listening to this is that one of the main arguments that farming has got for retaining the status quo is that we're not profitable. And I really dislike that as an attitude. We're supposed to be attracting in new entrants. We're supposed to be providing all of these services. You know, we need to be creating a situation where we kind of transcend this sort of poverty trap that farming seems to want to trap itself into. And start creating really valuable, publicly accountable, all singing, all dancing, blended, multifunctional businesses, right? That's my sunlit upland that I'm dreaming for. And every time I have this conversation with a farmer who insists that the return on capital is less than 0.5% and therefore we deserve special treatment, I think, why, I have to think it's harsh, but why are you still in business? Why are you still doing this? Because there are plenty of farmers out there who don't think like that.
And are those farmers making the kind of money that Dan is talking about there that would mean that they could, over 10 years, pay any inheritance tax bill?
They could afford tax planning and life insurance.
Well, as if to demonstrate that a week really is a long time in politics, by Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, Sir Keir Starmer said farming was top of his agenda. That didn't signal any change in this policy, and it didn't seem to impress some farmers, as on Thursday, a small but noisy tractor protest in Buckinghamshire curtailed the Prime Minister's visit to a building site. Afterwards, Sir Keir Starmer said it highlighted the difficult choices the government has to make.
These are political choices, but what you can't have is interest rates coming down, the growth we need in the economy, your waiting list coming down, and maintain the tax break for farmers. And people watching this will understand that that is a choice. They will know which they would prefer. Do they prefer their waiting list to come down? Do they want their mortgages to come down, the economy to start working for everyone? That's what we're trying to achieve. Or do we want to keep a tax break for farmers? But you can't have both.
The Prime Minister speaking earlier this week, and that's really enraged many farmers who say it is at best disingenuous. Listener Rob Stevens wonders what the evidence is to support that link between planning to reintroduce inheritance tax on farms and the recent decrease in interest rates. And he asks, I've heard ministers on the radio stating that this tax is crucial for raising much needed revenue. However, they also mention that it's possible to avoid paying the tax by gifting. If this is the case, why introduce the tax in the first place? Any thoughts, he asks. Dan, there are a myriad of ways that farmers can plan to get round this, aren't there?
Inheritance tax has long been described as a tax on people who don't trust their children. And if you have 7 years to go and you have children, then you're probably going to be able to plan your way around this. Not always. Everyone's different. And some people won't have 7 years.
How much will it raise? This is highlighted in a question from Tony, who says the amounts expected to be raised are trivial in the context of government spending. So he says this is not about economics, but is the politics of envy. I'm not a farmer, he says. I do need to eat food. Dan, government ministers have talked about raising 500 million a year. Others have talked about raising 200 million. Roughly, what are we talking about?
Well, 500 million is for scrapping the inheritance tax exemption for farmland and non-farming businesses. Now, farming is a small proportion of overall business in the UK. It's tiny. It's about 2%. The proportion of that 500 million that's relevant to farming is a lot higher than 2%, but it certainly ain't the whole 500 million. Probably it's about 200 million. That's just an educated guess.
Aled, even if farmers did have to sell some land to meet a tax bill, most likely that land would still be used to produce food. It would just be used by somebody else, wouldn't it?
Do you think so? We've got evidence to demonstrate quite clearly that that land is being bought for several uses and not food production alone. We're already seeing land being purchased simply for broad-scale tree planting, and that is having an impact on rural communities. It's okay to talk about, let's build the profitability of this industry, but ultimately, the here and now, you cannot tax these businesses because inevitably these businesses are going to fold and there'll be huge changes. Communities across Wales will lose that social heart within the communities.
I want to move on because we did have plenty of emails in support of this tax. Barry says the rest of us have to pay the full inheritance tax. He points out the non-farmers who buy land as a tax dodge are still saving half on their inheritance tax. Dave says farmers have been fortunate to be exempt from IHT up till now. Tax is where their grants come from. And Mike takes a slightly stronger line. In my view, he writes, this issue is symptomatic of the sense of entitlement of some of today's farmers who queue up for subsidies and advantageous tax breaks while failing to change their outdated, inefficient and loss-making farming practices, pollute the land and rivers and continue to restrict access to the countryside. Aled, what would you say to him?
Well, I've heard these stories so many times over and over and over, and I think it's simply not true. And you go back to the background to why agricultural support was embedded in government policies. It was simply to make sure that food is affordable to all people in society. You take the support away and inevitably food would have to cost more, or you rely on imports from other countries.
We did have an email from one tenant farmer. He didn't want us to use his name. He says, I am very angry about farmer protests on inheritance tax. We must in agriculture open the doors to younger people, look to help to drive the cost of land down. This measure from the government will not solve this, but he says it will help. Emily, there are farmers who support this, but are perhaps nervous to say so.
Yeah, I think so. And then in some of the conversations I've had with farmers who have at first instance been very angry about this, in the conversations I've had with them, it is really about the pace of change and the fact that what they thought was the settled plan for their business and the advice that they've been given, they've now been told they need to change. So I completely understand the anger, but I also think that we're only thinking about one particular part of the industry, and that's family-owned businesses. We're not thinking enough about the broader economic framework that supports tenant farmers. We're not thinking about the innovative community-supported arrangements that kind of allow people to get directly involved in food production. Tenant farmers have to pay rent. That's the first call on their business, right? And so them being profitable to do that is equally as a concern at the ability of family farmers who might have to pay an inheritance tax. And I think some of that has been lost. We don't really have that full picture of why family farms are necessarily better.
I want to move on to a topic that we had loads of questions about. Farmers haven't always been exempt from inheritance tax. That came in 1984 with APR, Agricultural Property Relief. And Colin, David, Brian and Stephen, amongst others, all really had the same question as Carolyn, who says, if it was really so bad, why are there any family farms at all? Why weren't they all wiped out by the tax? Dan, how did it work before?
Despite my appearance, I'm not old enough to remember 1984 myself. But look, the answer is in large part because it's incredibly easy for most people to avoid inheritance tax. There's a real danger of panicking farmers into thinking that every farmer who passes away is going to result in an inheritance tax bill. And all the evidence is that won't happen. Some people, due to family circumstances, bad luck, timing, there will be taxed. Most of the time there won't. So this is not Armageddon. And I think it's unfortunate to picture it as that.
Aled, you're an 8th generation. So what has your family been doing?
Yeah, well, I came home from university in 1981, so I remember the period very well. The principles whereby those changes came in 1984 was to stop the breakup of family businesses on death. The vitality of businesses does need that continuity from generation to generation. Now, this issue of being able to plan is perfectly reasonable. But unfortunately, and this is where the sadness comes in, is that the ability to plan has all of a sudden been taken away from a certain section within our society who are older, and these are tragedies.
So, Aled, are you talking here about the older farmers who are maybe 80 or 90 and don't feel that they have 7 years to gift the farm? Is that the people you're talking about here?
That's exactly who I'm talking about. And inevitably, those people are finding it so difficult now.
Let's move to targeting this tax. We've had a number of suggestions on that. For instance, Tim, who suggested that any land rented out could be exempt to encourage landowners, he says, to make more farms available for new entrants. Peter proposes that commercial farms producing food be exempt, while landowners using their land for instance, he says, horses, pay the inheritance tax. Dan, how easy is it to target a tax like that?
Well, I don't think that quite does it, because who do we want to tax, or at least who do I want to tax? I want to tax someone who has £1 million, doesn't want inheritance tax on it, so buys farmland and rents it out. I don't think that person should benefit from inheritance tax relief. They plan to give the farmland to their children, who will sell it immediately for following the guy's death, and inheritance tax free. That can't be right. It can't be right that if I inherit £1 million cash, there's no inheritance tax, but if I inherit farmland I turn into cash, there's no inheritance tax. That's illogical. So what I would do is I would have a clawback rule that says that if you inherit farmland, that is mostly completely free of inheritance tax. But if you then sell it within, say, 10 years of inheriting it, then you should be in the same position as someone who inherited cash. You should pay the tax.
That's something that the farming unions have also mentioned. Would it, though, raise the same amount of money that ministers are talking about?
It would certainly raise less from farmers, but it would raise more from people who are avoiding tax. Right now, if that hypothetical tax avoider puts £1 million into farmland, they will be completely exempt from tax.
Aled, is that the sort of compromise that you're looking for at this point?
Yeah, well, Dan makes perfect sense, to be honest with you. If I was to sell the business tomorrow, I'd live quite comfortably. And I would be perfectly happy to pay the taxation on the sale of those assets. But, when I pass my business to the next generation, they will work hard, they will continue the investment, they will continue to employ people, etc., etc., and you maintain that economic activity.
We have to bring this programme to an end. There's always so much to talk about. Dan, if you were in charge, what would you do with this tax now?
So I wouldn't compromise. I'd double down. I would forget the 50% discount. I would have a clawback so that there's a real bar on people using agricultural relief and business relief just for tax avoidance purposes. And having done that, you can, I think, then afford to not tax small and medium-sized farms.
Emily, what would you like to see happen now?
If the legitimate goal of this government is tax and innovation and growth, it can do those things in a much more considered way, and the evidence is there to do that. So I do think something does need to adapt.
Aled, the UK farming unions have a meeting with the Treasury next week. What are you hoping for out of that?
Well, I think we'll continue the messages that we've been relaying consistently right from the 30th of October, really, to be honest with you. And we do have to offer as well, because we will offer economic growth, because that is fundamental to the Treasury long term as well.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we have to leave it. Apologies to the many people whose questions we haven't had time for. We will, I'm sure, be coming back to this issue. And thanks to our panel, Aled Jones from NFU Cymru, Emily Norton, a farmer in Norfolk, and tax expert Dan Neidle. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Heather Simons, and Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.